Louisiana All-American Sports Show. 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 Louisiana. If the sports you want to talk about, then listen to the hottest show that's coming out the South. It's Eric Hatfield and Coach Perry Daniels, man. They're going to sit you down and tell you all about the game and make you plain. 96.9 FM, that's the station. To hear the best sports talk show in the nation. Without hesitation, you should get with this and get your popcorn ready, boy. You better not miss Louisiana All-American Sports Show. Louisiana All-American Sports Show. Louisiana All-American Sports Show. Louisiana. It's Joker Baby.
Woohoo! I'm just so fresh, so clean. Good morning, Baton Rouge, and you are locked and loaded and tuned in to another edition of the Louisiana All-American Sports Show right here on 96.9 FM WHYR-LP Baton Rouge Community Radio. Oh, it's good to be back in the saddle. Today is Saturday, August 18th, 2018, and hey, we're ready to rock and roll. We have an awesome guest today for you. I think you will like them very much, but as we always do to introduce ourselves, this is Eric Hatfield.
And I'm Coach Perry Daniels.
And we have a special guest on the line right now. It's a professor from Southern University Law Center. As many of you who listen to the show regularly know, I'm a student at Southern University Law Center at night. It was, and this lady gave one of the most compelling lectures I think I'd ever heard. And I told her right after class, and I told Perry, we got to get him on the show. Got to get Professor Bell on the show. I told Perry, you're going to love this. Professor Angela Bell, who is an endowed associate professor of legal analysis and writing. Her scholarly interests include social justice, restorative justice, criminal justice and procedures, civil rights and human rights. She teaches legal writing and analysis, legal research, professional responsibility, and constitutional law and minorities at Southern University Law Center. Professor Angela Bell is a native of New Orleans, Louisiana, and a 1998 graduate of the Southern University Law Center in Baton Rouge. Now, prior to entering law school, Professor Bell served as program director for the National Council of Negro Women of Greater New Orleans. After law school, she spent 10 years working at an appellate court and in this capacity gained expertise in appellate law. In 2008, she left the judiciary and began her career in academia as a law professor. That is just scratching the very, very surface and showing the very, very tip of the Titanic-sized iceberg. And as I often say on this show, why tell you when I can show you? Without further ado, Professor Angela Bell. Professor, can you hear us?
I can hear you just fine, and thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us. It is a real pleasure, and that applause doesn't even do it justice. Professor, I was thinking over the last couple of days where to start, and I honestly don't know where to start. So I guess what I'll ask is, kind of like you did for class, I guess tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I'll do my best. I am, of course, you have heard a law professor, but that is not the most important part of my life. The most important part of my life is using the gifts and the knowledge that I have to advance society and to always pursue the cause of justice. One of the things that I would like to talk most about is the upcoming November 6, 2018 election, because it has been a cause that I have been involved with now for several years, which is addressing Louisiana's very unjust, non-unanimous jury law. We are one of two states, Oregon being the other, who allow certain felony convictions to take place with less than a unanimous vote of all 12 jurors. In Louisiana, that would allow even 10 or 11 people on a jury to vote to convict somebody, which means that sometimes we have convictions when there are one or even two jurors who are saying there's reasonable doubt. That is not allowed in any federal court in the United States. You have to have a unanimous vote of 12 in the federal system, and it is not allowed in any of the 48 other states. They too require a unanimous vote of 12. Louisiana and Oregon are the only two states that will allow a person to be convicted of a very serious felony without the unanimous vote of all 12 jurors, and oftentimes that suggests to me that at least one or two people on that jury has reasonable doubt.
You know, that is it's you know, I think a lot of folks, I think the average person that does not pay attention to legal issues and civics, or maybe is not a political junkie, there's some folks in our audience who might be hearing this for the first time, or their eyes might have widened. And I remember hearing about this about 20 some odd years ago when I was taking an undergraduate business law class, and I always thought that was odd. And I remember the professor saying, well, he said, you know, you have to have 12. What processed in my 21-year-old head was murder. What I came to realize, it was only for capital murder. And then as so many years later, C murder, the rapper was convicted, of course, with a jury of only 10, and there was a lot of controversy there, and he was reconvicted. These are real world and also tangible instances of how I'll call it injustice, about how this kind of injustice can greatly affect lives and greatly affect society. What I found fascinating about your lecture is that you explained how it wasn't necessarily an issue that affected segments of the population, but affected everybody. You mentioned to get this through the Louisiana legislature, and you could probably explain this better than I can, to get it through the legislature to put it on for a vote, you had to get different coalitions involved with that unanimous jury bill. Could you discuss that? I think the audience would find it fascinating.
Certainly I will. And I also want to be very, very clear when we talk about Louisiana and Oregon being the outliers with this practice, we should not make the mistake of believing Louisiana and Oregon's laws are identical, because they are not. Under Oregon's law, you cannot convict for a first-degree murder with a non-unanimous jury. You must have a unanimous 12. That is not the case in Louisiana. So the laws are different in the sense that Louisiana allows even less of a Sixth Amendment protection than Oregon, because we are sending people to prison routinely for first-degree, second-degree murders, life sentences, without the unanimous vote of 12. So I want to make sure that that is extremely clear, that our Sixth Amendment violation is far more serious than the one taking place in Oregon. Now, in terms of how this happened, I want to say that this didn't start at the legislature in 2018, which is when the public started seeing a lot of press coverage. This actually started in about 2015 when I published the article in the Mercer Law Review, essentially questioning why for over, I don't know how many years, criminal defense attorneys and criminal appellate lawyers in the state of Louisiana have argued repeatedly to courts in the state of Louisiana that this is a racist system, which it is, and courts have said we're not going to entertain this because there is a Supreme Court case called Apodaca that tells us that this system is essentially legal and we don't have to hear it. At least that's how our courts interpret Apodaca. I disagree with that as well. But when I wrote the article, my position was lawyers have done everything in their power to get a court to entertain this, and courts have made it clear they're not going to touch it. Why continue doing the same thing and expecting something different? So my position in that published article in 2015 was the remedy needs to be different. The process for seeking the remedy should be different. This really should be in front of the legislature because we are the only civil law jurisdiction in the nation, and we should be approaching our legislature because we place such a high premium on law. So the movement really started in late 2015 when I joined forces with the ACLU in Louisiana. At that time, the director was Marjorie Yasmin, and we sat and figured the first thing that we need to do is educate the public. So the question was, where do we start? And we approached the chancellor at the Law Center, Chancellor John Pierre, and said, listen, this is historic. This is important. This is going to be the greatest piece of criminal justice legislation to impact any of us in our lives. Because of the far-reaching effects of this, do you have the courage to house this first forum? And he said unequivocally, yes, and has been committed to this work that I have done now since 2015. So that first forum started in 2016. In the audience that night was the reporters from The Advocate, who would later, 3 years later, release that research that we all know about. But that discussion began that night in that audience. And for 2 years after that, several of us have formed a coalition, the ACLU, of course, being one, the Innocence Project being another, Calvin Duncan, one of the exonerees who works at the Promise of Justice Initiative, Will Snowden from the Louisiana's Public Defender's Office, who also runs the Juror Project. We have sort of been a traveling circus, going everywhere we can, talking to every audience possible, civilians, lawyers, judiciary, and here is what we learned. Hardly anybody knew there was such a law in the book, and even fewer people understood the racial history. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about how we got that law, but I don't want to waste a lot of time on that because the history is probably the least significant piece of this at this moment. This law came about in the year 1898 when Louisiana had lost the Civil War. Louisiana was very angry with the federal government for coming into the state, having a war, winning a war, and essentially saying to Louisiana, you are not going to be allowed to own human beings and run an enterprise off the backs of free labor. Well, Louisiana said, okay, we don't have a choice now. We have to acquiesce because we lost the war. But as soon as the federal government left, as soon as Abraham Lincoln was killed, Louisiana did what it had been wanting to do already, which is fight to continue that enterprise called slavery. So one of the ways Louisiana did this was it was changing laws to begin the idea of criminalizing things that were not criminal before the Civil War and had no business being criminal after the Civil War. But they started to criminalize things because they wanted to use this new system called convict leasing. And so if we could get people under hard labor sentences in the state, we could lease those folks out, and guess what things they would do as lessees? They would do sugar and rice and farming and all the agricultural work that convicts or that slaves did, and as well as they did work on levees, a lot of things that were very, very profitable that this free labor base provided. So that's where the law came from. It was partly to staff the prison system with this free labor base, but secondarily it was to fight to keep blacks from exercising jury service, because at that point in history, there were about 44% of Louisiana's blacks registered to vote, and as you know, if you're registered to vote, you could be called in for jury service. So there was two bad intentions behind that law in 1898. The law was revisited in 1973, and only one change took place in 1973. It was raised from a 9 to convict to a 10 to convict. So that law essentially has stayed on the books. And what lawyers had been arguing for many years is that that law was of course, racially motivated, and it is. What I have learned through all of these years of research, though, is that the damage is so much far-reaching than what I have just said. If you think about the fact that we have criminalized a lot of folks, how did that happen? Well, one way is people are petrified of Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system, and many lawyers have advised clients in the state to take plea agreements as opposed to taking a gamble on the non-unanimous jury. So what we have done is incentivize plea agreements in this state, which means many people who are now convicted would not have entered those plea agreements were it not for this unjust system. Another thing that we have learned through the research is that this particular system causes juries not to carefully deliberate. They don't have to, if you really understand the way this works, because under a unanimous system of 12, you have to hear everybody's concerns, because you cannot register a vote until everybody has sort of counted in a vote. With the non-unanimous jury system, what we often find will happen is that jury will say, hey, let's take a quick poll before we even begin deliberations. Now, at that point, if you have 11 who say, I kind of feel like there's a guilty, and there's one saying no, there's no motivation to deliberate, and oftentimes there is no deliberation. So what we know through research, and this is not research that lawyers have done or criminal defense lawyers hiring experts. These are independent researchers that have spent the last 46 years studying this group thinking and deliberation process, and that research is completely reliable. And what it teaches us is that these unanimous juries are much more careful, much more thoughtful than a non-unanimous jury, and as a result, they end up with much more reliable outcomes. So this law has layers to it. The race piece, of course, is one, but it is not the only one. It creates the mass incarceration system that we all know too well here. It also causes a voting rights problem, because if you have taken people's right to vote because they're now convicted, you have a population of folks in the state, probationers, people who are under felony convictions who have lost that right to vote, who now cannot participate in the democratic process. They have been excluded. What is the logic in that happening? And were it not for this system, that would not be taking place. So what that means is all of those votes we've lost in Louisiana, the outcomes of our elections would be very, very different if we could include those people in our vote. Now, I want to make sure that everybody knows that we've made some small progress when it comes to voting rights in the state. In May of 2018, our law was changed to allow people who are under an order of imprisonment to be able to vote after they have had a 5-year period of freedom. However, that law will not be of any benefit to us in this upcoming election because it does not take place until March of 2019. So we're now left to deal with a population of people who should be voting in November, who would like to vote in November, but have lost that right because of a very deliberate plot in 1898 to make sure that we did not have equal participation in society. And there's more, but I'll take a break. I don't want to dominate.
Oh, Professor, I think, I just got a text from our programming director. I think he's just as thrilled and fascinated as I am to hear these topics being discussed here on the Louisiana All-American Sports Show. Perry, you've been patiently waiting like 50 Cent. I'm sure you have a question or 10 for Professor Bell. Fire away. I've done all the talking this morning.
Absolutely. First, I'd like to thank Professor Bell for joining us this morning on Louisiana All-American Sports. This is definitely an honor. If we could, Professor Bell, if you could speak to the issue of cash bail and how that adversely affects the minority community.
Absolutely. And again, I am so grateful to be here with you all. Bail is something that only comes about when somebody's charged and somebody obviously now has to report back to court. So we can't start the conversation with the bail because really there's a larger issue here, and the issue is really who's being charged. We know, and it's not anecdotal at this point, this is well-researched and data supports what I'm going to say next, but we know that disproportionately minority people are stopped, arrested, and charged at higher rates. We know that as a fact. So when we talk about the bail, we're often talking about minority populations, and we also know statistically that the people most impacted by any of these criminal justice decisions, which are often discretionary, are poor people. So now we're not just talking about minorities, but we're talking about poor people. And so what we're essentially doing is criminalizing poverty. We're saying to a person, if you want your freedom, pay this amount of money. If you can't pay this amount of money, we will take your freedom. So the question is, are we taking freedom because it's in the interest of public safety? Or are we taking freedom because it is revenue generating? And if you agree that it is revenue generating, you will then go back to what I said earlier about Louisiana's resistance to ending this thing called slavery. It has always been about building an enterprise that is going to be revenue generating, and we have to be honest about that. It's not a conspiracy. These are things of fact. Before I get too far for bail, I do need to tell you one other thing as we speak about bail and revenue. Louisiana's criminal justice system was really something that came about after the Civil War, and it's important that you understand this history because it all fits into this bail discussion. But there was a man who fought on the Confederate side called Major Samuel James. He was a Confederate general, which means that he wanted to keep slavery. Now, when they lost, he didn't just quietly go away and say, I'm defeated. What he did is says, I'm going to continue slavery. I don't care what the federal government says. So this man who owned a number of plantations, one of which we all know about, it's called the Plantation Angola. He became a very prominent architect in the design of our criminal justice system, this man who fought to keep the Confederacy, Samuel James. And what he did was use these plantations that he owned to have these slaves go to work so that he could become, in his time, a very wealthy man. So please understand, the model was shaped by a Confederate general. The model was not shaped because of public safety interest. The model was shaped because of capitalist interest. So this bail discussion fits neatly into that, and unless we are putting this in context, we're not being honest about our criminal justice system. So there is a movement afoot across the nation to help people understand what bail is and what it really means, because for a lot of Americans, to hold them in custody for a day or two means that they have lost the job. And when you have lost the job, it means that I can't pay rent. And when I can't pay rent, I'm evicted. And when I'm evicted, I'm homeless and I can't pay a car payment, so I don't have transportation. This is the reality of what cash bail does to many people. And what we fail sometimes to remember is that these are not guilty people at this point. These are accused people at this point, and many of those people end up being innocent, meaning they were convicted and should not have been charged, and this is what cash bail does. So I oppose it, and it is something that I think we need to begin to consider as a state. And I think also people have to become aware that it is an obligation, as I learned in civics as a very young child, that if you are a citizen and you are a part of a democracy, you have no right to be on the sidelines. You must be engaged. And these things that we are talking about, we are all obligated to decide that we will act to change these systems in the way we are gifted to do it. So some of us can write these things. Some of us can use social media to educate. Some of us can be before the legislature. But one thing I know we all can do is we all have a talent, and that talent has to be used in the direction of advancing society and making some of these changes that are long overdue. We are, many people will tell you, out of the Jim Crow era, out of the Civil Rights era, when you listen to the things we're talking about, the facts don't bear that out. We are dealing with Jim Crow today. This law that we're discussing, non-unanimous juries, is a Jim Crow era law. This concept of bail, all of that based in slavery in Jim Crow era. We are not where we need to be, and that is not acceptable for people in this particular country. We are wiser, we are capable, and we are not engaged enough. That's why this stuff is taking place. And we are in a position as a civilized society to take a stance against this, and we should.
Professor.
Amen.
Professor, I two quick comments. One quick comment, and the other I wanted to ask you about is a big part of your work. The first thing is, it almost sounds like you kind of heard in kind of a narrative in progressive media that there's no Jim Crow, it's James Crow Esquire. And this sounds not so subtle. This sounds like Jimmy Crow, Jimmy Crow crack corn. I mean, it sounds very in your face almost. You only have to peel back a layer or two of the onion from what you're telling me to see that. Is that a correct takeaway?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. You're absolutely correct. And I have to tell you that much of what is yet to be learned has not been exposed. This is a lot worse than many people know. And I'm not just saying this to cause people alarm. I'm saying this as a person with a law degree now for over 20 years. I'm saying this as a person who has studied this in great detail. I'm saying this as a person who's worked on some of the biggest campaigns in the state to free people from this injustice system. This is worse than we are willing to acknowledge, and a lot of it has yet to be unveiled to the public. But it is overdue that these discussions are happening, and I'm so grateful to you for what you're doing.
Professor, the next part I wanted to ask you about is the part that I know when I heard the lecture, I think almost everybody in the class, to a person's jaw, either was literally or figuratively on the floor. Your work with the Angola 3. Can you discuss that with our audience?
Certainly. The Angola 3 case involves 3 Louisiana men who had been guilty of criminal activity in the late 60s and early 70s. Those men were arrested on different charges. They did not know each other at that time when they lived in New Orleans, and they were all brought to the Orleans Parish Prison in the early 1970s. They were put on a tier by the guards with the specific intent that they, because they were criminals, would hopefully engage in criminal activity and harm the other men on this tier. Those men were the Black Panthers, who had just been arrested in New Orleans on charges involving them occupying a home that they supposedly didn't have a lease for. And so they were put on this tier with these 3 men, Albert Woodfox, Herman Wallace, and Robert King, with the hope, of course, that they would just cancel each other out, which is often the way things work behind bars. But something amazing took place, and that is that those Black Panthers began to suggest to these 3 men that there is an obligation on the part of Black men, and it is to be leaders in their communities and in their homes. And so they began to discourage this idea of them being predators in their communities and them committing criminal acts. And these 3 men separately had an awakening at that moment. And each of those men, as they went on to serve their times later in Angola, began something very heroic at that time, which is they started a campaign against prison rapes in Angola. At that point, in the early 70s, Angola was still segregated. Angola had a system of using white inmates as guards, giving them shotguns and allowing them to take the lives of people in their discretion that were violating rules. Angola was under court orders at that point because of so many abuses in terms of health, medical, legal. And so at this very violent prison, these 3 men, after being armed with this information from the Louisiana Black Panthers, that they decided they were going to do something different. They weren't going to be predators anymore, but they were going to take a stance in their community, which at that point was behind walls. But they started the very first Black Panther chapter behind prison walls in segregated Angola in 1972. And, of course, that was not a welcome thing on a plantation, right? And so when a crime was committed, unfortunately, a guard was murdered, a very brutal murder, by the way. He was bludgeoned with a lawnmower blade. Fortunately, if someone had a desire to solve that crime, they could have, because it was a very bloody crime scene and the most ideal crime scene in America, because all of the fingerprints were on file. But instead of choosing to solve it, they used that as an opportunity to frame these 3 men, threw them in solitary confinement in the year 1972, and said, this will be our way of ending this movement you think you started. Now, There is such a thing called a God in my world, and I believe that is how in the late 90s people discovered these men who were to die. That was the plan, that they would just die. But they did not die. Help came in the late 90s. Unfortunately, Mr. Robert King was released in the year 2001. He is still alive and doing remarkably well. Herman Wallace was released in 2013. He was freed on a Tuesday and died on a Friday, largely due to neglect, medical care that he did not receive when he should have in Angola. And then Albert Woodfox was released in 2016. He is alive and doing remarkably well now and lives in New Orleans. He spent 43 horrific years in solitary confinement, was tried before the juries in Louisiana. And by the way, I should note, they were non-unanimous juries, twice for this crime that he never committed, was ultimately freed after 43 years in the functional equivalent of a parking space. Herman Wallace spent 40 years in the functional equivalent of a parking space, and then Robert King well into the 30-year mark. Now, when I say solitary, I mean very extreme conditions, usually about 6 by 9. I mean no human interaction. So your toilet is in that cell. I will not use the word bed because there is no such thing, but it is a cot with a very thin mattress, much like you would send with your 5-year-old to the first day of preschool, and your food is served in your cell. So the design is that you are completely isolated. You do not interact with any human being. You do not go to church. You do not go to classes. You perish under those conditions. That case set a precedent for the entire United States and caused some reforms to happen, but this matter is not yet resolved. There are about 80,000 people presently living under these extreme conditions in the United States. And what alarmed me most about this case, and the reason I got involved, was this simple thing. I learned through my research that there are two ways that people can be put in solitary confinement, one of which is that they have committed some infraction behind prison walls, and a disciplinary body inside the facility will say, this is the remedy. I can actually accept that on some level. That did not cause me great alarm. What alarmed me was that the second way you get in is a prison warden has the authority to say that you belong there, which means there is no committee involved, there is no process that allows you to make an argument this is not correct, there is no real meaningful way to get yourself out once that happens, and that is in fact what happened with these three men. So Robert King was actually in Orleans Parish the day that God was murdered. When he arrived at Angola, he was thrown in solitary confinement and told, you're being put here because you're under investigation. Now, under investigation for what? Because I just got here? You're not entitled to know. That is what got me involved with this case. And what I learned about this case is that there were some profound misunderstandings back in 1972, and it remains the case today about who the Black Panthers were, and it was the result of those misunderstandings that made the prison fear these people so much and think that they could only live in isolation because they were some radical hate group that they were sort of equating with the KKK, and that is not factual at all.
I'm almost speechless here, and people listen to the show know that doesn't happen very often. You mentioned Robert King was in. How did that happen? That he was in Orleans and still they hung a murder that happened in Angola on him? I must have that must not have registered the first go round when you told the story. How's it even possible?
Well, what happens is, remember when they were in Orleans, they were on that tier with the Black Panthers. So the Orleans records reflected that they were Black Panthers. So that is the reason that when he arrived at Angola, they felt you're under investigation because you're a Black Panther. And remember now, Herman Wallace and Albert King is already in solitary confinement because of the murder of this officer. So King, who was not there, had nothing to do with this, in the eyes of the prison, must be associated just by virtue of the fact that you're a Black Panther, and so were they. So that was the reasoning, and you know from being in law school that is not reasoning, by the way, but that's the reasoning that they use to suggest that he should have been under investigation. But I cite that just to explain to you how frivolous of a process it takes for someone to be put in solitary confinement under this thing called administrative segregation. And once these inmates are placed like this, it is virtually impossible for them to get out. And so what I found in my research is there are cases of inmates who have dreadlocks, for example. That's enough for a prison official to say, I'm going to place you in solitary confinement. There are cases where inmates have filed litigation and have become very successful. That has been reason enough for prison wardens to say, we're going to place you in solitary confinement. So they don't have to articulate a logical reason. They don't have to even articulate a reason. They are like parents. I get to punish you because, and nobody gets to check them. And that's the reason I got involved with this, because there are many medical doctors now who have gone on record to say, we have looked into what this does to people. This is inhumane. This is the functional equivalency of torture. This is causing psychosis. This is causing hallucinations. This is causing an increased rate of suicides. Now, remind yourself, this is happening to people who have not yet been convicted. So some of these people who are innocent are going to be released, and they're going to come out further traumatized than when they went in. And we all should know the famous case of Khalif Browder, because he's the textbook example of how this thing is a bad situation for people in America right now, because that was an innocent man who was subject to these harsh conditions of solitary confinement, and even with the support that he had upon his release, it caused his demise. Of course, we know he took his own life because he just could not undo the trauma of this system. So this is another one of those very, very quiet parts of our criminal justice system that people don't know, and people really don't get invested in, because oftentimes when you hear prisoner, you assume that we're dealing with somebody who's bad, and you assume that if they're bad, they deserve bad things. But my work has shown that that is not the case in Louisiana. A lot of our prisoners are people who are poor, who just don't have resources to mount a defense. A lot of them are people who are scared of Louisiana's non-unanimous jury system, who said, I will give my life a few years before I would go before a jury and give all of my life. A lot of our prisoners are people who were convicted by juries who were in a rush, because our system is designed on this thing we call efficiency. Do it fast. Don't worry about doing it right. And a lot of people are there simply because they did not have the help they needed to build the campaigns that should have been built to free them. And one of the cases that I talked to you all about that night was the famous Soledad case of John Clouchet, who is not a Louisiana prisoner, but he's certainly an example of what I mean by people who are overdoing their time in custody because they don't have help. This is a 75-year-old man who the parole board said on 4 separate occasions, let him go. He is parole eligible. He is fully rehabilitated. He is 75 years old. There is no security threat. He has done the time that we asked and gave us more than we required. But that was a case where the governor of California said, you know what? I am not going to let you out, because back in 1972, you wanted to be friends with Angela Davis and George Jackson, and you wanted to participate in civil rights activities. This was in the year 2018, people, and if it weren't for the help of a volunteer attorney in California who generated no income off this case, myself and a team of about 8 law students who filed a petition to the United Nations and said this is a violation of every human rights principle on the books, that man would have perished in prison. He walked free in May of 2018. 75 years old, and this is the fate he faced. So I'm suggesting to you, when you hear that someone is in prison, it is not always proof that they are guilty. There are many people who are free, who are not innocent, and there are many people who are in custody who are not guilty. And we have to get away from this complete and blind trust in a justice system that is not always just, not always fair, and not always interested in the truth.
Hey,
go ahead.
Eric, if we could, if you could prepare the last text I sent regarding the mayoral candidate in Shreveport, I would like to get the attorney's perspective on some recent news regarding what took place this past week with the mayoral candidate in Shreveport. While you're getting that ready, I would like to ask the attorney, Attorney Bell, I've recently heard that when young people of the dominant culture come in front of a judge in a courtroom, their charges are externalized, meaning that there's some external factor of why they committed the crime. Yet when minorities, African Americans or other minorities come in front of the judge, it is internalized, meaning that they are a bad person, similar to your statements that you just made. If you could speak to racial sentencing discrepancy, and have you seen that in the judicial system?
Yes. In terms of the Shreveport candidate, I have not received the text, but I can comment to the extent to say to you that Shreveport is doing what is yet to be done in Lafayette. Those same monuments are there, and there has been great resistance in Lafayette to addressing that. Shreveport has done what West Feliciana Parish has not done. I just walked past that same monument as I entered that courthouse, and there is resistance to moving it. So Shreveport is to be applauded for its desire to remove that manifestation of Jim Crow, of bigotry, of slavery. The thing I want us to remember about these monuments is this. Let's go back to what I said earlier about Louisiana being very resistant to the federal government coming in and saying you must end slavery. A lot of those monuments were erected after that point to make sure that people never forget that we don't really care if the federal government came and put some stuff on paper called the 13th Amendment saying you can't own slavery. The monument is there to let you know that the South is still the South, and that the Confederacy is still the Confederacy, and the federal government didn't run us off. That is also why a lot of the school names were changed down south. That was in direct response to the federal government coming here and fooling people into thinking that it had won a civil war. So those monuments, the names of those schools, they were strategically placed to send a message that the Confederacy still runs the South. That is an important point to understand when we talk about these monuments. So when that candidate received that letter, that was just a public record allowing that candidate to remember that this is what the South is about still. It is still a Confederacy. We don't really care what the 13th Amendment and the federal government has said. And so I just want to make sure that as we have these conversations, we never allow ourselves to lose context to how the groundwork was laid for our criminal justice system and how slavery ended in the state, because that is an undercurrent in all of these different conversations. It is also one in your second question about how context is often added to these cases when you have different players. So oftentimes you will see, for example, people, I've seen cases where there might be a white defendant on trial, let's say for a drunk driving case. but that person is not going to be labeled a defendant or a drunk driver. They're going to be a student who just had a lapse, and oftentimes they're going to have the resources to sort of get into a program to suggest that they've already gotten the help and the rehabilitation they need, so they don't need the criminal justice system. Whereas when you have poor defendants, oftentimes you don't get that same narrative created. You get the narrative that this is a defendant and this person is a danger, and as a result, they need to be removed from the public. Now, is that race or is that bias? A lot of times what I see at work is bias. And I don't mean to give an excuse to people, but I would like to be honest about what I often see. I often see judges, I often see prosecutors, and I often see police be programmed by the news media that keeps showing that same image of that black man between 17 and 25 with those dreadlocks and those gold teeth. And so eventually they begin to be programmed, not even aware sometimes of that kind of bias that affects their judgments and their decisions about who should be prosecuted and how they should be sentenced. So that is an important piece of this that we shouldn't overlook, because sometimes this is not intentional. And we need to also be honest about that and understand that bias does play a role in criminal justice decisions. Now, does law schools address it? No, they don't. Does bar associations address it? No, they don't. I'm just seeing a movement in medical schools to begin to address this stuff. So that is where some of this problem comes in, that law schools are going to have to take that responsibility to understand that just like you educate people on those codes and those processes, they also have to be educated on bias and how it can impact decisions that they make, and that is something we do not do enough of.
Coach, I got that for our audience. I got the Shreveport case queued up. Do you want me to go ahead and play that for the audience to kind of catch up if they weren't familiar?
Yes, sir.
All right. Here we go, Professor.
Less than 24 hours after reportedly receiving a threat, mayoral candidate and Caddo commissioner received a threatening flyer at his family's home. 2 agencies are now looking into it. KSLA News 12 has chosen to blur out a racial slur on that flyer. Jasmine Payute is continuing our coverage on this investigation tonight. Jasmine, the FBI is now involved.
Marie, investigators from Louisiana State Police and the FBI are both looking into this. The FBI responding to our call for comment by saying that they take all acts or threats of violence seriously, and they are committed to investigating crimes that are potentially motivated by hate. The agencies are looking into this threatening letter sent to Shreveport mayoral candidate Stephen Jackson. Paired with a picture of his face, the letter said to leave our statue and property alone, appearing to allude to the Confederate statue on the north side of the Caddo courthouse. Now, state police could not say much about the investigation, but we do know they're looking into it. Right now in the studio, Jasmine Payute, KSLA News 12.
Well, several.
So that was the mayoral candidate Stephen Jackson. He received basically there was a rope around someone's neck, his face crudely pasted over it, and said, "Leave our property and statues alone. Get out of our race. N-word." So that's what's going on right here in the great state of Louisiana as we speak, Professor.
I also want to mention along those same lines, as we think about the response to that letter, I would like to see that addressed. That's extremely important. But I also would like to see a similar reaction to the many prosecutors in the state of Louisiana that have decided to pursue cases when they knew they did not have the correct defendant, they knew there was evidence that would exonerate that defendant, and they deliberately withheld that evidence. So along the same lines as we hope to see who sent that letter and to be sure that person is prosecuted, I would like to see interest in prosecuting prosecutors who are deliberate actors when it comes to bringing charges against people who should not be charged. We have a pattern of prosecutorial misconduct in this state, and I want to be clear that I'm not talking about mistakes or negligence, because we're all capable of that. I'm talking about deliberate decisions to pursue charges when we know charges should not be brought. There has been too many instances for us to continue to have this conversation. And at this particular moment, there's only been one prosecutor in the entire state of Louisiana to even be called out for this. And when I say called out, I mean there was no punishment. The Supreme Court essentially says, yeah, you did it, but we don't think it rises to where you should be punished because the person was ultimately exonerated. And I find that alarming, and I want to make sure that it is known that this is not just me, again, trying to resonate fear, but this is something that has been recognized by the United States Supreme Court on a few occasions when cases have been brought before their attention. They have specifically brought out in those decisions that there are problems with prosecutorial misconduct in the state of Louisiana. And that is something, as we discuss this letter and possibly addressing a penalty for whoever sent it, we need to not overlook the fact that we have official actors who are not being penalized for destroying people's lives. And when you put somebody in prison wrongfully, you have to remember you have victimized the community, because the person who actually committed the crime remains free. So that is a serious offense to do that. But not only have you destroyed the life of an individual, you've destroyed the lives of their children and their loved ones. In many of these cases, when this happens, family members die prematurely. We have one famous exoneree here in Louisiana, John Thompson, was a dear friend of mine whose funeral I had no business standing at, but for the harm that was done to him by the state of Louisiana in signing multiple execution warrants on a man who they knew was not guilty. So that is also a call that I ask today as we have these discussions, that we not forget also that we have people in ties. You know, not everybody in the orange jumpsuit we should be focusing on. We have people in business attire carrying law books who are violating people's rights and committing crimes who are not facing justice as well.
We have about 8 minutes remaining, and by the way, in 8 minutes we have Noel Jackson with Music Satisfaction coming up shortly. But I guess
Eric, can I take this time to thank Professor Bell not only for joining us today, but in helping create and develop the next generation of prosecutors such as Eric Hatfield that will go out and bring some righteousness to the prosecutorial process. We thank you.
Well, listen, I'm one of many advocates in the state of Louisiana who are committed to doing this work, so I appreciate you recognizing it, but I do not do it alone.
Professor, could you, I guess, before we go, I guess we didn't quite get to the, I don't want to use the word happy ending, but I guess if it's even possible in 7 minutes to talk about how we finally got those Angola 3 out. And also, if there is any bit of time remaining, talk about other ways outside of the disciplinary system that you can put a check and balance on a prosecutor, such as maybe a very high-ranking prosecutor in the state that doesn't want to play ball by the rules.
Sure. I'll talk to you quickly about the prosecutors. One of the things that is happening around the United States at this point is, instead of going to disciplinary associations, who happens to be the only place to go with a complaint like this, and instead of trusting the Supreme Court, which is the only body that has the authority to discipline a prosecutor, a lot of states are now moving toward just removing those folks. So putting the effort now into voting progressive prosecutors in office and removing prosecutors such as the ones that we talk about, or the DAs who are employing the bad ADAs. So that is where my attention lies at the moment, is shaping campaigns so that we can get people who have a commitment to justice and not a commitment to convictions. That would be my first response, since these other systems have proven to be failures for many years. In terms of the Angola 3 and how they got free, they simultaneously had two things going that I think many defendants have to have in a state like Louisiana. One of which is that they had a skilled legal team that filed everything imaginable in court, but that is not what caused their freedom. They also had an advocacy team, which is what I think played a large role in that case coming to an end. And the advocacy team did all kinds of stuff to keep this case in the public. Once the public got invested, pressure came down, and that is what brought this case to an end. So I cannot underestimate or overstate the case for the public being involved in cases of injustice wherever they may appear, because that is how justice takes place. I also want to remind people that there are deadlines involved in getting registered to vote. So if you are not registered, please, with all urgency, get out and register to vote. You can even do it online if you go to the Secretary of State's website. All those details are there. And if you are registered to vote, please do everything in your power to get everyone you know to get up and vote in the November the 6th election. This is historic, and this is the way we express our affirm our approval or express our dissent when we need to have it heard. So please be sure you are a registered voter and that you do go out to the polls and vote on November the 6th or in advance of November the 6th.
Well, once again, I want to thank her for joining us, Professor Bell. Thank you. We had an icon transition this past week. We've got to get some of her song in as we leave today. Also, overnight, we had the great Kofi Annan pass.
What?
The first Black African to lead the United Nations. He led from a position of compassion and yet strong leadership. So we want to acknowledge that ancestor as well. And Eric, if we could cue up song, start playing a little of it. Most folks know this as the song that En Vogue made, but prior to En Vogue, there was Aretha Franklin. Thanks again, Doc.
Professor, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been one of the most compelling interviews we've had in 6 years of Louisiana All-American Sports, and thank you so much for making it possible, and keep doing what you do, and I'm confident I'll see you very, very soon around campus, but thank you so much. Thank you both for what you are doing. This is incredibly important, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to join you this morning. Thank you. You have a wonderful day, Professor. You too. Bye-bye. That was Professor Angela Bell of Southern University Law Center. We will get this up on demand as soon as possible. But without further ado, there was a legend that passed away this week. It's funny, Perry and I have been working together now. This is our 8th academic year of covered athletics, and I knew off top that the song of the day would be Aretha Franklin, and fittingly so, here we go. Got about 30 seconds left, and I'll tell you, I don't think I'd heard the Aretha version. I guess I'm one of those young bucks, but it gave rise to the En Vogue version. Lord have mercy. At 17, I remember breaking one of the biggest sweats in my life the first time I saw that video. Oh, the inspiration. Rest in peace.
Hey, Eric, great show today, sir. Hey, man, I'm just proud of what you're doing, and I'm looking forward to you making that transition into a courtroom, into the legal profession. We need more guys like you in that profession.
Thanks, Coach. That's really humbling when you hear you say stuff like that, and I just hope to do my best.
Oh, well, we know you will. We know you will. Hey, man, so I guess it's time.
Yes, sir.
ADT, JNS, love you.
Have a good afternoon. Noel Jackson with Music Satisfaction coming up right now on WHYR.
All I